Why don't we kick things off? You want to get us started, Mike?
Yep, absolutely. Hey, everybody, welcome to session 23 of Beers with Engineers. Will and I are super excited to invite you yet again to join us to talk about kind of the intersection of ServiceNow and cloud native technologies. Um, we'll, if you want to kick us forward, we'll start off with the usual safe harbor notice, right? Some of the things that we may be talking about today may not come to fruition exactly the way that we discussed them. They may not be fully released and or generally available as of yet. So, don't go make stock buying decisions based on this and try and keep this as, on the DL as possible, although we will be publishing this to YouTube, so it's not exactly a secret to anybody. Um, so we'll go ahead and talk through kind of the general agenda. And we always try and keep it informal. If you may have noticed, as we go through this, as people join, we make sure that they have the ability um, to talk. So if you have questions, thoughts, concerns, please feel free to come off mute and just chime in and ask questions as they go. The more interactive, the better it is for us. And then, so let's talk about why we're here and why we kicked this off. So the whole point that Will and I tried to solve with this is that we realize that ServiceNow customers aren't necessarily super talking about where they are in their cloud native journey, and they're not talking to each other. And there's a lot of folks who don't even understand that ServiceNow has capabilities in the cloud native space. So we really felt like it was important to build a community for people to talk with each other about kind of where they're at, and also for us to get the word out that ServiceNow has a lot of capabilities in this space, and make sure that people are taking advantage of it in order to, move down their cloud native journey. So let's talk about who we are. So I actually used to be at ServiceNow, but I went to the dark side as a customer. So I'm now the enterprise applications manager for a company called DRW out of Chicago. I love any and all things technology, and I've been doing it for far longer than I care to admit. I am all about trying to utilize technology intelligently and efficiently in order to solve business problems. I'm a big nerd in all things nerdy. I love board games, I love video games, and I love jujitsu, and I love spending time with my family. So I am again not drinking beer today because I am trying to prep for a jujitsu tournament next month. And so I'm trying to get down into the right weight class. So water it is for me again today. Over to you, Bill. Will, what beer are you drinking?
Yes. Thankfully, I'm not training for jiu-jitsu, trying to make weight, so I will be enjoying a one of my faves, a Juice Bomb Northeastern IPA from the green screen is
In
blocking it.
front of
Juice
you.
Bomb Northeastern IPA from Sloop Brewing.
Hmm.
A little bit about me. I'm a advisory ITOM architect at ServiceNow. Currently working in a new team since January called the ITOM Center of Excellence. Um, for those of you that may be unaware, starting with the beginning of this year, we've taken the ITOM, IT Operations Management functionality, and instead of having it kind of off to the side, handled by what's called a team of specialists from a sales and sales engineering perspective, that's now what we call graduated into our core suite of products. So now when you're talking to somebody from ServiceNow who's talking about outcomes having to do with our ITSM solution, for example, that same core team is now also going to be talking about things in the IT operations management space. And then the convergence of those two things is something that we call service operations or service ops. So if you hear, your ServiceNow team talking about service operations, service ops, that's really the intersection between IT service management and IT operations management. I've been working in technology for at least 3 decades now, doing different things around IT operations, server engineering, and really kind of late, my keen focus and interest has been in automation, finding recurring tasks that can be fraught with human error when they're done manually and create nice automated solutions to take that off the plate of our very important technical contributors. In my spare time, I like to hang out with my family, play a little bit of pickup hockey, and enjoy some video games. Okay, so now into our tech deep dive for this month. And just to call out, this is the 2-year anniversary. We did our first Beers with Engineers in on St. Patrick's Day of 2022. So now we've passed 2 years of doing this, and Mike and I like to say this is like our favorite work day of the month, is when we get to just get together with some folks and talk about some of this cool technical stuff and hear from you all as far as what your challenges are, what you've run into, what you've discovered, and kind of enriching everybody as part of as one of the results of that. So this month, we're going to talk about cloud provider metrics and the fact that you can pull those into your ServiceNow instance via our agent client collector. So this capability comes with the agent client collector monitoring, or ACC-M capability. So if you're a ServiceNow customer and you have our, for example, our ITOM visibility or ITOM enterprise, or ITOM operator enterprise or pro, you're going to have this capability to pull metrics out of your various cloud providers. And the way that's implemented is with a group of plugins with policies out of the box, as well as the ability to customize the existing policies, create your own, etc. They are available in slightly different capacities for AWS, Azure, and GCP. And I'm going to kind of dig into the detail behind that as we kind of progress through our deep dive today. One kind of underlying theme that I saw as I kind of set each one of these up and use them to pull metrics in from my cloud accounts is they do require credentials. So for if any of you are discovering AWS, for example, today, you are hopefully adhering to the best practice of leveraging things like assume role capability to do that. This functionality right now does not leverage that. It wants a kind of old school, either in Azure it'd be a service principal, GCP it'd be a bearer token, AWS it would be an API key and secret. And these plugins do all kind of require that you have that today. The one thing I would say on that is, because all it's doing is pulling metrics, it's a fairly, well-controlled, minimally permissioned service account that you would need to create, or service principal in Azure. So it's, it's from a risk perspective, it's pretty minimal, but that is something to be aware of, is that today that's how this functions. It is expecting kind of just a credential for these API calls that it's going to make to be available within your ServiceNow instance. So what specific metrics can we pull? Just kind of run down through how each of the 3 cloud providers is monitored with the content we have today. So I've got a couple slides here that basically just break down the policies that are present in an out-of-the-box installation of ACC-M, and then the underlying scripts or executables that they use running on your agent host or hosts to get the data pulled into your ServiceNow metric intelligence metric base. And that's, I guess it's probably worth just calling out that when we say it's pulling it into the platform, it's not actually sticking all these metrics into a table in your instance. When you have ITOM visibility and metric intelligence within your platform, you actually have what's called a metric base instance that's running off to the side. It's similar to the way, if you're familiar with Health Log Analytics, similar to the way that with Health Log Analytics, you have some additional dedicated compute that's spun up kind of next to your ServiceNow instance proper and is used to process that very specialized log data. And we do the same thing with metrics by virtue of this metric base, which is it's essentially a purpose-built database that focuses on time series data. And all the scripts and executables that are used to pull the AWS metrics, they're deployed via an ACC-M plugin called monitoring-plugin-AWS. So what that is essentially a payload that when you activate these policies within your ServiceNow instance, it's going to automatically distribute this payload in the form of a compressed archive file so that all the requisite programs that are needed are present on your agent host. So here's the second page that just kind of runs through the scripts that you get out of the box. And then it highlights down here the plugin that gets deployed. And just a couple observations that I made myself when I turned this on. It does use some resources on your agent host. When I first turned it on, I had kind of the default, rather conservative CPU protection settings in place on my agent host. And within a couple iterations of pulling metrics from my AWS account, and I did have basically everything turned on because I wanted it to do something. So it ran my CPU up to 15%, something like that, which invoked the automatic agent protection. And so my agent immediately stopped collecting. So I did have to adjust that threshold accordingly. And if you're looking to do this in production, my recommendation would be have a dedicated agent or two that are, set up for redundancy to pull these metrics from AWS. If you've got, a reasonably sized AWS footprint. The AWS flavor of this does not, there's nothing built into it to make customization as easy as it is with the Azure capability that I'm going to show you in a couple minutes. So with Azure, we provide some built-in hooks where you can essentially customize what metrics for what kind of CIs you want to pull. With AWS, we don't quite have that level of ease, but all of the scripts that are used are visible. They're Ruby scripts, so you can go in and modify them. So it's kind of like a medium level of customization. They're not compiled executables, so you can get in, see what they're doing, make a copy, and have it do something, if there's some additional type of cloud resource that you want to monitor, that's feasible to do, starting with what you've got out of the box. And so now that we've kind of given the overview, let me just switch into demo mode and just kind of show you what that looks like within the instance. So in my instance, I've got everything that ACC-M does is controlled by these policies. And out of the box, you got several AWS metric policies that are available. Oh, well, two policies, but this one is kind of the main one, and it's got multiple checks that run inside of it. So this policy is the one that I turned on for my account. And then I designated a specific host, which is running our agent to use as what's called a proxy agent. And so we have kind of two fundamental types of content that you can run using Agent Client Collector. One runs directly against the host that's running our agent. And that would be things, our agent will run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. And so if you want to, for example, monitor endpoints which are running Linux, Windows, or Mac OS, you've got a large number of checks which can execute via the agent directly on that host and give you information on that host. In contrast, and when we're talking about things like cloud providers, you can't run, there's no capability to run our own agent within AWS, right? So the way we accomplish monitoring is via what's called a proxy agent. And that's essentially just a proxy, a server, which is running our agent, which we then designate as this is going to run the commands, the AWS commands in this case, on our behalf. And so I've kind of designated that, pointing my policy at my specific agent right here. And so what that does, if I look at my agent, which is a Linux server, that starts to push the requisite content into the file system onto your proxy agent so that it can execute the checks that are part of that policy. And so if I go to my cache directory, which is created by the agent, we can see that we've got a subdirectory named after that plugin that I called out before as being the plugin that contains all the AWS monitoring stuff. And so that's kind of the format that we use. We push these things down from the instance in the form of we basically stick them in the work queue for the agent. And then when the agent phones home to the instance, he says, hey, I've got some new monitoring plugins for you. And the agent says, okay. And it pulls them down and stores them in this cache directory. And then if we go under there, it's got kind of a standard looking directory structure where it's got bin for binaries. And then because it's using Ruby makes use of a module subsystem that it refers to as gems. And so there's a gems subdirectory to store those Ruby modules, and then a lib directory that's used for shared libraries. And then when I go into the bin directory, I can see the different scripts, which then tie back to what's in the check instances for this policy. So if I scroll down within the policy, it shows you check instances, which is essentially the individual commands that the policy will invoke on your proxy agent. And so if I look, for example, at the AWS metrics, drilling into that will show me the specific command that's being run, has some usage information. And the nice thing about this being a Ruby script is that it's completely transparent. If you want to see exactly what it's doing, I'm in this directory on my agent, and I can just look at the script directly and see what it's doing. And that's what I meant when I said we don't give you an on instance way to customize this, but you can start with this content and make your own version, which perhaps pulls different metrics than what's in there out of the box. And these scripts, in the case of the AWS content, they are using the standard Ruby AWS API library to make these calls. And to see the specific metrics that they pull in, that's actually listed right here. And so it's a frequent question that'll come up. A customer has this capability. They'd like to know, hey, what metrics am I going to get? And so in the case of the AWS stuff, this is how we answer that question, is just by looking at this content. If you don't have the policy activated, you can always get this content by just clicking into the plugin itself. It's stored as an attachment in the ACC plugins table. So for every plugin that gets distributed to an agent host, we'll have a record. So here's the AWS one. And so if I wanted to just peruse, hey, what scripts is this pushing down to my agent? I can just grab this attachment, pull it down to my local machine, unzip it, and peruse the scripts to see what they're up to. And so here's an example of just a couple CPU metric records coming in for some EC2 instances that I am gathering via this policy. This is what's called Insights Explorer. It just lets you kind of ad hoc drill into CIs and pull data based on what's coming in via the available metrics for a given CI.
Hey,
So
Will,
yes, sir.
just sorry, want to jump in. Dave's got his hand raised. Dave, I'm guessing you want to jump in with a question.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that. My fault. I was trying to click on something else. Sorry.
No worries. No worries, Dave.
No worries.
Yep. But good day, sir.
Good day.
It's good to see you guys again.
You too.
Yeah, likewise. So yeah, with Insights Explorer just gives you an easy way to browse the metrics that are coming in for a given CI type. You can generate charts, and then with the plus sign, you can create a saved view so that when I reload the page, it always comes back to essentially a blank slate, empty canvas. And then there's a pull down list which remembers the views that I've saved off to the side and lets me kind of recall those as I need to. So that's kind of the overview of how the AWS metric capability is put in place. I did put out an inquiry about making it more like the Azure one that I'm going to show you, where there's more ability to cherry pick the metrics that you want via an interface that's completely within the essentially managed within the instance, as opposed to having to create a custom plugin. And I'm told told by the product team it's on the backlog. They're actively assessing it, because there's other work in place around open telemetry, which is a little bit of an overlap. So they're trying to prioritize that stuff. So I would say if the concept of collecting AWS metrics via ACC-M and then having that additional ability to more easily customize what metrics and what CIs you're interested in is of interest, provide feedback to your account team. We have our idea portal, which is ostensibly kind of the primary front door for asking for enhancements or upvoting existing recommendations. I know sometimes I'd heard skepticism in the past that those ideas go anywhere, and kind of had a little bit of that myself, but actually our upcoming store release is rolling out a couple capabilities that first were asked for by the idea portal. There's some stuff around adding service mapping affinity to mid servers. So in other words, having specific mid servers aligned to discover certain application services. And that was something that originated on the Idea portal. And that's going to be reality, I think, with the June store release is what I saw. But anyway, that's just, I kind of wasn't 100% sure how ideas were, how that intake of ideas occurred or if it occurred. And so the fact that we've got that feature rolling out as a direct result of enough people expressing interest on the Idea portal kind of reinforced the my impetus to recommend the Idea portal. And it's very easy to enter something. So it's kind of like why not provide your feedback there?
Yeah, it's
to try-
happened on multiple occasions that I've seen where stuff comes in as an idea and it eventually rolls out into a store app update. So it's
Nice.
definitely worth utilizing that. I have a couple of clarifying things. One, you had said that this comes with ITOM visibility. I would
I'm
have thought
sorry.
that
Yeah, I missed, good
health.
catch. Yeah, it would be health. It
Okay.
would be the health standalone SKU or the ITOM Operator Pro.
Okay. The other point, and this is just to clarify for me, this is really effectively you've got an EC2 instance running inside of your AWS. That's your proxy host, and it's basically hitting the API in order to pull these metrics and aggregate them and funnel them back to the ServiceNow instance. Is that an
Correct.
accurate statement? Okay.
Correct.
And one thing I haven't wanted to mess with, but I also have questions about is the cross account capabilities. If I have a whack load of accounts in my org, do I need one of these per account, or can I do this, cross org level?
Could we use the existing AWS configs that we have set up across the orgs to?
You can. So you got a couple options there. One of the ways, so I just did this kind of simplistically in my policy. I just assigned a single proxy because that was all I had was my one test agent.
Mm-hmm.
And I only have one AWS account that I can work in. I don't have ownership of an entire AWS org that I can do that kind of cross account testing with. So what I did, let me see if I can get back to the policy record here. Something's like eating my CPU, I guess, because it's refreshing really slowly. So I've just got the single proxy agent option. Ugh, come on. I've got the single proxy agent option checked, and I've just got my single. So you can either do a cluster or you can do multi-proxy agents by scripts. In which case, if you wanted to target, so the CI type that this policy pulls against is just the AWS data center. So you can do something like you can run it against AWS service accounts, and then based on the service account that's being selected, you can select a proxy that aligns to that service account. The way I believe this will work, if you don't distribute, because it's using the API key and secret, you would just stick multiple, like you'd have an API key for each sub account. You'd align that. You'd list those all under a credential alias. And then it's just it's just going to tick down each credential that's in the alias and execute against that. And
Got it.
so you don't have to necessarily point it at a given sub account, because that's kind of integral to the API key itself.
Yeah.
Again, I kind of derive that by looking at the way the code is put together and how it runs. I don't have the ability to run that myself. But that's what the doc said is it basically said if you put multiple credentials in the alias, it'll just run through each one and pull the metrics that secret, that API key and secret are entitled to pull.
That's nice.
So yeah, it's I think they just kind of walked the line of not wanting to require that you had a specific setup like for discovery with assume roles and stuff in place just to pull this stuff. So they just kept it off to the side, simple API key and secret. Honestly, there's no requirement that this proxy agent run in AWS from our perspective. A lot of organizations are going to require that by virtue of their network traversal rules, including ServiceNow. ServiceNow has network traversal rules that they'll block API calls to AWS from outside AWS. So I had to put my mid server in AWS just so it could make the API calls. But we don't explicitly require that. If you had an on-prem agent, as long as it had the ability to run AWS CLI commands, you could use that to pull the metrics if you wanted to.
Makes sense. Any other questions before we shift gears to the next one?
I had one. I missed the beginning, but is this going to be supported in GCP also, or?
There's a GCP capability. It's a nice segue. That's the next flavor I'm gonna
awesome.
Go into. All right, so GCP. So the way it's put together for GCP, for whatever reason right now is it's actually just an option that's baked into kind of a one size or a one-to-many executable called common checks, which is available on the, it's available as part of the monitoring plugin modules plugin, which is a bit of a kind of general purpose plugin that deploys a lot of different supporting scripts and executables. So this is kind of the least transparent of the flavors of the three cloud providers. In that it's a compiled executable, so you can't just kind of look at the contents to see what metrics it's pulling. It's focused right now on GCE, the compute engine, the VM information. And another kind of slight difference, this has a dependency on discovery. You have to discover your Google Cloud VMs in order for it to then construct the query that it hits the GCP with to pull the metrics. And that's something that it shares with the Azure approach. It does the same thing. It basically iterates through the list of resources of a certain type that you've discovered and that are in your CMDB, and then it specifically queries for the metrics against each of those CIs that are in there. So you've got that prerequisite where you need to populate your CMDB with whatever it is you want metrics for, and then you can get those metrics based on what's in your CMDB. And so what that looks like on platform.
And does it split those so the VMs that are under one org, right? It understands it can query those against that org, but there's a different org for another set of the GCP
It does.
VMs. Okay, awesome.
Whoops. So the policy that turns that on is called GCP, GCE metrics. I guess the plus side to a slow loading browser page is it gives me an opportunity to have a sip of my beer. So again, we've got the proxy agent settings. In this case, I've got, and again, this isn't a requirement, base requirement of the product, but within our specific corporate infrastructure, I need to query GCP from within GCP. I can't just spin up an on-prem standalone agent host and query our GCP stuff because we've got some security around that. So then if I click into the check instance to see what command it's actually running under the covers, it's running this common checks command, which is kind of it's a wrapper that then has different modules compiled inside of it. And one of those is metric GCP. And this is going to get run against each Google Compute Engine VM that's found in my CMDB. And that's done by virtue of this option in, there's a monitored CI. That's on the, how did I get back to AWS? Whoops. So that we've provided, and part of rolling this capability out included providing the ability to specify the monitored CIs as the result of a script. So looking at the GCE policy, instead of what we typically see with a lot of the out-of-the-box content, is we're just doing a simple filter where we specify a CI class and then apply one or more filter settings to pick a list of CIs that are going to be monitored. In this case, we're actually using, we're using JavaScript to query the Google Data Center record and return back the corresponding Google projects that need to get queried from the metrics API call. And then if I go to my GCP proxy agent, our mandatory idle timeout on SSH session is not a friend to those of us who have to do demonstrations. So here's my, I bet that's the, no, that's the mid server. So I've got my Google Cloud mid server. And again, there's no requirement at the platform level that that be co-located in the cloud that you want to pull metrics from. It's really just a function of what your specific network traversal rules within your environment mandate that you do. So again, if I go to the var cache folder that the agent creates, and I've got my monitoring plugin modules directory. And I've got just the common checks executable. So there's significantly less flexibility with the GCE stuff in that if you wanted to pull other metrics, you'd really have to kind of create your own script or executable more or less from scratch and generate the query. And then the one thing that in order to make sure that the data was in a format that you could then kind of ingest, you'd want to look at this cloud metrics check type within the instance, which is what controls how that data is parsed. And based on the JavaScript that kind of underpins this check type, which there's going to be JavaScript under the covers that's parsing that data. In theory, you could kind of back into getting other metrics from Google that match that format, and then you could ingest those via a custom check. But again, kind of on the spectrum, that's pretty close to the highest level of difficulty to get like kind of additional custom Google metrics out of GCP. So I would say if that's something of interest, again, future direction is determined so much by customer voices. I can't emphasize enough that if something would be of value, get that funneled back through your account team, put something in the idea portal or upvote it, because that's really what drives the future direction and where the resources go. So that brings us to the what we provide with Azure, and the Azure metrics, that's the most recently updated capability. So currently, you know, and I break it down in the slides that there's different, we've got kind of a mix. So we've got some that are similar to the AWS, which is a self-contained Ruby script that has specific metrics that it's going to pull. And so that's things like for various Azure DB instances, Azure Kubernetes clusters. And then we've got a more generic check program called Azure Metrics Collector. And this is kind of the metrics collector, the most advanced metrics collector, because it takes it, we've broken out the actual metrics and the CIs that are collected and parameterize them into JSON payloads that the collector actually just reads. And then that's how it determines what metrics it collects. And that's all delivered via this separate monitoring plugin called Azure Metrics Collector. And so when I get back into the instance, I'll run through what we provide out of the box, which is there's a few policies that make use of this that you can use as a starting point. And so kind of the major where this is kind of stands above the other two cloud provider metric capabilities is we include in our documentation a process for adding new metric policies, and it doesn't require a custom plugin. You just create a new JSON file, upload it as an attachment, and create a new policy, and then you'll be pulling in new metrics that were previously not included with the out of the box. This does require that you put your agent framework into developer mode, and that is in the documentation. I also call it out here. There's a property called snagent.dev mode. You set that to true, and that kind of allows you to add those kind of externally produced JSON files to direct the metric collector. Similar to the GCP metric collector, it does have a prerequisite that you discover your Azure estate and populate CMDB with your Azure resources. And I think I already kind of touched on the fact that the broad strokes of the process are you create a JSON file. There's examples in the documentation where you essentially say, here's the resource type I'm interested in, and then here are the metrics that I want to see for this resource type. And then you create a new policy that corresponds to that set of CIs and metrics that you're interested in. So as I went through this process, I made a couple observations that I wanted to share. So it does have a pretty good debugging capability. You can actually adjust the check definition so that it adds a parameter called -no-log, and you set that to false, and then it puts copious logging into the agent log directly when it's pulling these metrics. And that was actually really handy for me because the test I was doing was I was running it against Azure VMs, and the initial filter that I used to select the target of VMs was a little too broad. So when I tried to run it, it was actually pulling in VMs as well as scale sets. And one of the kind of boundary conditions for pulling these metrics, and that's kind of listed down here in this bullet right here. Oops. I always want to click on the slides and then that advances them. So this bullet right here talks about how all the resources in a given batch have to be the same resource type. And so I was getting no metrics for my VMs because it was actually pulling in VMs and scale sets because they matched my imperfect filter. And I discovered that by using the debugging capability. And then I fixed my filter and then everything was good. And so the other limitations are all the resources in a batch have to be in the same subscription and they all have to be in the same region. So what'll happen is when the script that runs as part of the policy selects a list of CIs, it's going to kind of make sure that it's bunching them together so that they meet those requirements. And so what that looks like on platform. And so the nice thing about this is, for one, you don't have to go on the agent or download the plugin to see what metrics are being pulled. It's all handled on platform. So let's see, Azure VM metrics is the one that I kind of turned on. So let's see. Try and get this a little more readable. Come on. So the filter that I'd set up, let me see if that's still refreshing. So basically the filter I set up was just going against my VM instance table and then looking for an object ID that matches that Azure syntax to denote an Azure VM. And then I'm not sure why. Let's see if we go here. Just trying to get visibility to the script that it uses to pull down the VMs. I wonder if that's, oh, that might be on the check instance tab actually. And then what the documentation has you do if you're doing a custom policy is you just create a JSON file which lists the resource type and then the metrics to pull. In the case of this, since it's an out of the box one, we've got that JSON file already available. Let's see. And that's passed as a parameter right here. And then if we go to under agent client collector, there's a big file table. And so then what it actually does under the covers is the check instance that runs on the agent host. It pulls this file from the platform. It reads this file, uses it to generate a list of monitored resources, and then it stores that in the form of this file here that's underneath it. So this file, that file underneath there, that's dynamic, and that gets refreshed every time the check runs if need be, if new CIs have been added to the CMDB. And again, like the syntax for this is added, or it's documented in the documentation. You can also just download a copy as a starting point. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so it's a little bit of an eye chart, but essentially you've got a fairly basic JSON payload. The top line tells it what resource type to target, and then there's a list underneath that, which just lists out all of the metrics that you want to pull. And so if
And it
you
looks like
were,
that's based on the Azure definition for the Azure metrics monitoring platform.
yep,
Cool.
yeah, and there's a link in the when we send out the slides, I included a link to the underlying Azure API call, which provides some additional information as far as kind of the rules of the road for what you can query from that Azure batch metric capability. And so there's actually, I had a question from a customer recently because AWS now has this concept of a metric stream where you can make CloudWatch metrics available in the form of basically kind of like a Kafka stream. And so I did have one customer that expressed interest in if we were going to kind of move in that direction from a ingestion of AWS metric perspective. And that is kind of one of those options that is being kind of considered as far as the kind of the next generation of what we pull out of AWS. So if there's interest there, again, provide that feedback back through the channel you prefer, so that we can kind of make sure the product team is aware of what our customers are most interested in. And so just to kind of round it out, the result of that whole thing is you get the ability to pull metrics from your various cloud providers. And then what can you do with those? So we actually added a little scoped app, which is super powerful. It gives you the ability to very easily establish thresholds for these metrics and then feed those into event management. So there's a scoped app called Metric Rules now. And if you're a health or a ITOM Operator Pro customer, you can create rules against any of these metrics that are coming in and use those rules to trigger events, which then go into alerts when a threshold is passed. And we do, this is kind of on top of the ML driven establishing of thresholds based on metric baselining that occurs. So when you start pulling those metrics in, the system will start baselining those and present candidates for alerts. The problem with that is there's a ramp up time for it to learn what's normal and then establish the machine generated thresholds. If you want to kind of skip that part of the process, at least for stuff that's just well established, you can go through this scoped app and which presents just kind of a nice streamlined user experience for selecting CI types and then metrics, and then setting a threshold and setting some basic rules for escalating, whether it's a single sample, an average of sample over time, or just all sample values over time. And the result of that is that you can get these alerts when, you know, for example, a CPU threshold is exceeded.
Hey, Will, what's the default polling interval on the metrics?
I think out of the box, it's 60 seconds. Just go to
Yeah,
the
it
policy.
looked like it was 1 minute in that script that
Okay.
you just pulled up that JSON payload. The very bottom there, it said deep polling
Oh, that's right.
interval,
Yeah, it had the
time grain.
Okay,
time
cool.
frame.
Thank you.
But that's, I guess that's probably, there's probably two things in play there. That's probably the granularity with which it's pulling the metric data. And then there's also the polling frequency within the policy, which is going to control how often it pulls the data. So you've kind of got a couple dials available there. You can adjust the granularity of the data itself, as well as how frequently you pull the data down. I would love to know what's slowing my computer down so much. I like to kill some processes, but I'm afraid of killing the wrong thing and then terminating the entire webinar.
Yeah, that might be bad.
Are you guys going to do another Beers with Engineers panel or session at Knowledge?
Still open to that. Right now I don't have any funding. Last year we had a nice kind of planets aligned, and the cloud observability folks wanted, you know, to have some to have a session where they could dig into the newly announced SG Hotel. And so
Yeah.
far nothing like that's presented itself. So
Yeah, we were looking at AI ops and implemented the Hotel Service Graph Connector for discovery. So we're still kind of wading through that to understand how good some of the data is versus how not as useful some of the other data is. So,
gotcha.
but yeah, I was going to ask about that, and then if you guys have any recommendations for good sessions that you know about in Knowledge.
I have not seen the catalog yet. but I will give it a perusal, and if things jump out, I'll include it in the wrap-up notes when we send out the
Excellent.
slides and such.
I saw one that I'm interested in. It's I think it's for the App Engine Studio piece, but it's basically recreating Marvel Snap within ServiceNow. If you've never played that game, Marvel Snap, it's like a mobile game. It's silly and fun, but I was like, that sounds like a blast, if nothing else, to just go and build a game in the platform. So
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
yeah.
And well, so much of what we do is underpinned by App Engine. It seems like it really behooves anybody who works in the platform to get familiar with App Engine, Flow Designer, all that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, so it looks like the default interval for collecting metrics is 60 seconds. But that's, you've certainly got the ability to tune that.
Hey, and just really quickly, we're 5 minutes over, so I don't know if we want to wrap up the formal session and then shift gears into questions.
That's everything I had prepared. So unless there's any more questions about the metric stuff, we can go into roundtable mode.
Before you go to that, how is this ACC-M works in conjunction with the HLA?
A couple different ways. I guess the most pronounced way that it functions directly with HLA is ACC. If you have HLA, then you can use the agent client collector to actually collect endpoint logs and send them directly into HLA. And then the other way that it works with HLA is if HLA is reporting, if HLA is raising alerts against CIs or CIs that are related to alerts that are coming in from this, those will all get collected together so that you kind of have them all in one place for one person to analyze instead of a bunch of different alerts that potentially could be getting assigned to different people without awareness that there's something bigger going on. They both sit, within the standard event management framework. And so they both get the benefit of the correlation and the noise reduction that occurs within that capability.
Okay. How is this different from the traditional item health? Like, how would it benefit from this new ACC-M development that you're introducing? Like, what feature would you differentiate per se?
Well, it augments what you can do with health, because health traditionally had been an event, a receiver of events. So you would have external point solution tools like SolarWinds. In AWS, you'd have CloudWatch, and those would be each monitoring different pieces of the infrastructure. They would each have their own set of thresholds. And then when a threshold was passed, they would send an event into ServiceNow, which then would fall into event management and become turned into an alert, which would then get correlated with other alerts that were coming in from those various sources. What this gives you the ability to do is potentially reduce that tool sprawl and get those cloud metrics directly into ServiceNow, at which point they can generate alerts directly without having to go through a separate tool. So a common scenario that we'll see is where a customer has this capability and they also have a point tool that they've as a legacy that they've used to monitor aspects of their compute environment. And they're seeking to reduce that tool footprint and get rid of some of the tools that they've had. And this gives them the ability to do that. They can just use ServiceNow to pull in their cloud metrics, for example. They don't have to manage thresholds via CloudWatch alarms anymore. They can manage them all on platform to reduce and kind of reduce the toil involved with maintaining that. That's
Oh,
that's generally what the kind of the sweet spot for this.
gotcha. So get rid of the intermediate layer in between.
Yes.
Oh, okay, thanks for that.
Yeah, and it moves the intelligence around, you know, kind of what constitutes a problem out of a third-party tool and into the ServiceNow platform, right? So now we're ingesting the raw metric data from these cloud components into metric base within the ServiceNow platform. And then we can utilize the kind of like AI baselining as well as the um, the threshold building directly within the ServiceNow platform, as opposed to, like Will had said, kind of replicating and duplicating those efforts in some other tool and then ingesting the data from that other tool into ServiceNow.
Gotcha. Thanks for that.
No problem. Cool. All right. Well, so thanks everybody for joining the session. As always, Will, thank you for the amazing tech deep dive. And we'll go ahead and shut down the recording now and then open it up for our standard post-session question and answer roundtable. So thanks, everybody.